In his conference at the Valde Discussion Club in Sochi, Putin used the platform to launch a complex critique of Western policies while outlining Russia's strategic vision for the future. His speech, conducted in conversation with Fyodor Lukyanov, blended a defiance, strategic positioning, and ideological assertion. He acknowledged Donald Trump's political tenacity, labeling Trump as courageous. He praised his ability to navigate through legal entanglements and political adversity. He hinted at potential openness to renewed US-Russia dialogue, implying a readiness to engage if Trump were to assume office. The remark underscored Putin's preference for leaders less aligned with the traditional Western establishment, whom he perceived as perpetuating an anti-Russian stance. He described NATO as an anachronism, a sharp rebuke he reserved this sharp rebuke about NATO, which Putin described as a relic that exacerbates rather than alleviates global tension. He laid the blame for the Ukraine conflict at NATO's feet, accusing it of overreach and security destabilization in Eastern Europe. His assertion that NATO thrives on having a persistent adversary to justify its existence reinforced his broader critique of Western military and strategic policies as provocation under the guise of peacekeeping. Expanding on his ideological critique, he denounced Western neoliberalism as having degenerated into a coercive system. He portrayed it as an agenda that marginalizes cultural and national diversity, imposing uniformity that stifles sovereignty. This rhetoric taps into the broader narrative of Russia positioning itself as a defender of traditional values and a bulwark against cultural and political homogenization imposed by the West. Putin's vision of a multipolar global order stood as the thematic backbone of his address. He called for a shift away from a Western-centric system that he characterized as serving only elite interests. Instead, he advocated for a just and balanced framework that respects the unique interests of diverse nations, positioning Russia as a leader, championing this alternative structure. He cited the growing support from nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America as evidence of a global shift away from Western dominance. The president also addressed Western sanctions, depicting them as miscalculated measures that had backfired by imposing economic strain on their instigators while fortifying Russia's own industrial and economic capacities. He highlighted Moscow's pivot towards self-reliance and increased partnerships with nations such as China and India, painting an image of a resilient Russia, unfazed by external economic pressure. In an effort to temper his otherwise combative rhetoric clarified that Russia doesn't view Western civilization itself as an adversary. He drew a line between cultural appreciation and opposition to political policies. This nuance aimed to separate the perceived cultural richnesses of the West from the aggressive foreign and ideological stances of its governments. When he came to address digital sovereignty, he emphasized Putin's commitment to maintaining control over its own technological infrastructure. He described the reliance on foreign tech as a security risk and called for a sovereign internet and domestic AI development, underlining these as essential to national security. This aspect of his speech tied into broader concerns over Western data dominance, portraying Russia's digital strategy as a necessary defensive measure. Of course, begs the question as to why so many Western components are found in Russian bombs that are hitting Ukraine. And as for his Pacific approach, his moderation, I don't see very much moderation in drones loaded with grenades and bombs that are actively and specifically pursuing civilians in Kherson. Concluding his remarks, Putin spoke of the restricted landscape for Russian media in the West. He positioned the RT channel, for example, as a channel of resistance, capable of challenging the narrative dominance of Anglo-American media networks. I've been interviewed on RT, and I don't suppose I'll ever be interviewed again, because when you're interviewed, very often, you arrive early, and you're left waiting while listening to the previous subject. And the previous subject, in the last time I did this, was couched in rhetoric and propaganda and rubbish that simply wasn't true. So when it came time for me to talk and my interview was being conducted, I'm afraid I referenced the previous piece considerably and pointed out that it was untrue. I felt that was my duty. As I say, I don't expect I'll ever be asked again. But otherwise, I don't really look at RT. It's very difficult to do so anyway. But it's not a channel of resistance. It's not a channel of truth. It's a channel of weighted propaganda. This commentary of Putin's doubled as both a critique of Western media censorship of by Western governments and a defense of Russia's alternative approach to global communication. His speech at Valdai signalled a consolidated stance. Russia was not only defiant in the face of Western criticism, but assertively championed a distinct ideological and geopolitical path that emphasizes multipolarity, cultural autonomy, and economic resilience. In framing the West's policies as a source of global tension, he positioned Russia as a leader, advocating for a new world order that resists Western hegemony. And I find it extraordinary that in all our talk of sanctions, in all our talk of resistance to Russian propaganda and stuff, we have been extraordinarily reluctant to put forward our own views, to call out the deceit in Russian, to get that message across on Russian airways. I don't understand why we're being so why we're pussyfooting so much around this issue. Russia's propaganda isn't for us. Russia's propaganda is for the broad swathe of the Russian people who are seduced into compliance, who are complicit in Russia's attack on Ukraine, simply because that is the only information they're given. It's a great shame that in supporting Ukraine, we're not using our talents to get the message across to the wider Russia that they are being fed rubbish. They're being fed a daily diet of propaganda and hatred. I hope that with Trump's arrival, some of this will change. But I don't imagine the Western laziness and the Western obsession with sanctions and fighting will be undermined. The greatest fight is not with weapons. The greatest fight is with ideas. And we're not engaged in that fight.